Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Hi, welcome to today's episode. Today we're going to be talking about autoimmune disorders. And I wanted to do a podcast episode on this topic because it is March, and in March we celebrate women. And the topic of autoimmune is one that affects women in 80% of all autoimmune cases, so significantly more than men. And as is quite typical with a woman-focused disorder, it has been quite under-researched or badly researched, and I will get into that in a bit.
Yeah, I think not only are women so much more affected than men for autoimmune disorders, but also autoimmune disorders themselves are very prevalent. They're the third most prevalent disease category following cancer and heart disease, which I didn't know about that, or the fact that 80% of cases are female before researching this topic either.
Yeah.
What I also found interesting is that it's not just autoimmune disorders that are more prevalent in women, but it is the differences between male and female immune systems.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is also the case that females generally have stronger innate and adaptive immune responses than males. And this also results in beneficial things like having greater vaccine efficacy. So it has been found that antibody responses to seasonal influenza vaccines, for example, are at least twice as strong in women than men in terms of their effect. However, as part of this increased immune response, autoimmune disorders are sort of a negative consequence that come out of this.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to jump right into why autoimmune disorders affect women primarily more than men. And one of the main mechanisms found is that the prime suspect is the chromosome X. Women have two X chromosomes, whilst men only have one. And in order for women to not express double the proteins, what happens is in embryo, every cell in the body makes the decision to silence one of the X chromosomes. And this silencing is driven by RNA strands called exist. And when the silencing goes wrong is what is thought to be one of the causes for later on leading to autoimmune. So that's one of the mechanisms that has been discovered when the silencing goes wrong with these exist RNA strands. However, for years when researching autoimmune, they did these studies on male mice. And of course, male mice don't have two X chromosomes. And so, of course, they weren't making a lot of progress with the research because they weren't even studying it on a female mouse model. And it shows the dangers of just using one gender, especially in such a highly, in this case, gendered disorder. And, the clue is in the fact that it affects 80% of women, right?
Yeah.
80% of all cases.
Yeah, it seems so obvious, but
Yeah.
It's so important when studying disease to try to use models that actually have validity in the sense of they have the key features of human disease, which, for autoimmune disorders is the sexual dimorphism.
Mm-hmm.
So, another thing that there's quite a few things that implicate the X chromosome in increasing propensity to autoimmune disorders. That seems to be, or increasing immune signaling in the body, that seems to be also evolutionarily conserved, which is quite interesting, because I found that, for example, the fruit fly Drosophila contains many innate signaling proteins found on the X chromosome, and they show sex-specific induction following certain infections. And also in some lizards, it's been shown that the phagocytotic activity of macrophages, which are a major immune cell, is greater in females than males, and this is because of suppressive effects of male hormones called androgens, which maybe we can mention later about also the role of sex hormones in immune differences. But also within humans, and also for the purposes of this episode, I suppose we should mention that we're generalizing women or female to mean those with two X chromosomes, and males to be those with a Y chromosome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But in humans, it's interesting because there are also some people have not just XX or XY. There's also patients which carry two X chromosomes and a Y chromosome, which is known as Klinefelter syndrome. And they are phenotypically male and have male hormonal patterns, but they also have an increased autoimmune risk, and they have immune systems similar to what is typically seen in females with two X chromosomes. So yeah, the role of the sex chromosome is obvious in autoimmune disorders. And before diving more into what you mentioned with the RNA called exist, it's also important to mention a key thing about RNA is that a lot of our RNA obviously encodes genes that are then turned into proteins through translation. There's also a lot of RNA that is not translated into protein, and these are mainly regulators of RNA translation, or they regulate other things like the structure of chromatin or transcription or other genetic processes. And those one subset of these are called long non-coding RNAs. Another subset is called microRNAs. And interestingly, the X chromosome also contains 10% of the around 800 microRNAs that are found in the human genome. And this compares to the Y chromosome that only contains 2 microRNAs. And some specific microRNAs have been implicated in sex differences in immune responses. In terms of long non-coding RNAs, well, exist that you mentioned is a long non-coding RNA, and it therefore mainly binds to other proteins to form a ribonucleoprotein complex, and it is transcribed from the inactive X chromosome so that its transcription then leads to the silencing of that chromosome. Some genes that can escape X inactivation have also been shown to have specific roles in contributing to autoimmune diseases. For example, the toll-like receptor 7, but without going into any details for that, the idea is just that if the genes escape X inactivation, then they would be expressed more, since the role of X inactivation is what we call like gene compensation. And so these are also implicated in the development of autoimmune disorders. And so the picture I'm trying to get across is just that there's definitely implications for the processes of X inactivation for the development of autoimmune disorders in females. But there's also many different pathways that this can happen through. And so I found an interesting recent study by a group of researchers at Stanford University that quite strongly implicated exist ribonucleoprotein complexes in promoting the female sex-biased autoimmunity. And so what they did is they were able to introduce an inducible allele of the exist gene into an autosome, so not the sex chromosomes, in mice. And you might be thinking, how did they do this without also inducing chromosome inactivation, since that's the role of exist? So they did have to use a truncated version of the exist gene, RNA, to prevent the chromosome silencing. But they then had chemically induced system to induce an autoimmune disease, and this was systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE, which I found is a model of autoimmune disease that is often used in animal studies, at least, probably because it's quite robust and easily inducible. But in humans, the ratio of this specific disease is also 9:1, 9 females to 1 male. So it's also like a particularly high prevalence in females compared to other autoimmune disorders. And so what they showed was that in male mice that had the exist RNA added to their genome with the induction of the autoimmune disease SLE, 5 out of the 8 mice, it showed female level pathology across multiple different organs like the kidneys and the lungs. But importantly, these males also had elevated autoantibodies that are known to be elevated in female mice, which is the main mechanism that occurs in autoimmune diseases, because it is when the immune system of the body recognizes its own proteins as being antigens. So they get an immune response elicited by endogenous proteins instead of extrinsic disease-causing proteins.
Yeah.
So another interesting detail, though, about the finding was that not only were the autoantibodies against the exist RNP complex higher in the male mice than in the male induced exist mice, but it took time for them to reach the same levels as the females. So after 12 weeks, they still didn't have as much autoantibodies as the wild-type female mice, but after 16 weeks, they achieved the same levels, which suggests that it's like a process that occurs throughout time where they accumulate autoantibodies against the exist RNP. And the final thing that they found was they then went back to humans and they looked at autoimmune patients with SLE, and they found that they also had more exist associated proteins and significant reactivity towards many different components of the exist RNP complex, further implicating the exist RNP in human autoimmune disease. And so overall, I think this study was quite comprehensive evidence for the exist RNP in itself promoting autoimmunity.
Cool. Yeah, really interesting, and a really robust explanation of the importance of X chromosome silencing and how that leads to autoimmune disorders. But zooming out a little bit and thinking about the general profile of what are autoimmune disorders, how they occur, when they occur, and what are the current treatments. So firstly, the current model of autoimmune disease is one that suggests that there are individuals that are genetically susceptible, and they later on respond to an environmental trigger which actually causes the autoimmune disease. So in women, it tends to occur after either a traumatic event, childbirth, or menopause due to hormonal changes. And there's also been a few studies about disruptions in like the microbiome and things. So autoimmune diseases are when aberrant B cells and T cells, which are part of your immune cells, produce autoantibodies, which have been mentioned, and these provide valuable biomarkers for diagnosis. And even though only later on you may present clinical symptoms, actually there's a period called preclinical autoimmunity where you can detect these autoantibodies. And early detection may be quite vital, because it can allow you to initiate therapy early to prevent or attenuate tissue damage. And while autoimmunity may not be static and remission is challenging, it can be achieved by some patients with the current treatments available. Autoantibodies act through a few ways. They can either mediate disease through their antigen binding site, and they interact with the cell surface receptors to alter the cell function. They modulate the receptor functions of the cell, and they can also eliminate cell populations. They also may form immune complexes, which are an amalgamation of antibodies, and then they're deposit within tissues, such as within the kidneys, which drive inflammation and cause autoimmune disorders.
That's really interesting, because I found that in terms of sexual dimorphism, males and females differ differently throughout life. So we have mentioned so many times how there's increased inflammation in females, but this is, I have to highlight, this is mainly in post-puberty and in adulthood. So whereas it's actually been shown that there's increased inflammation in males in utero during childhood and pre-puberty, and then in old age. So I'm wondering how much this has to do with intrinsic factors and of sex differences, or if it's also because of environmental contributions. And surely hormones have a large role in this, because that is what is mainly changing across puberty and life. But like you mentioned, women being more susceptible in old age and in menopause, that kind of really heavily implicates hormones.
Yeah, definitely. And things like the microbiota can also be a trigger for autoimmune. You know, the body is comprised of bacteria, viruses that coexist, and if there is a disturbance in the composition of the microbiome, it can lead to dysbiosis and disturbances in homeostatic functions, especially in the immune system. But also, in preparation for this episode, I listened to a lot of other podcast episodes hosted by doctors and patients that had that either treated autoimmune disorder or had an autoimmune disorder. And it was really interesting because they really highlighted the personal life factor a little bit. So I mentioned earlier that trauma can be a cause, and it's interesting because these doctors would see time and time again, sometimes they would be family doctors, and they would be able to see the progression of someone's life and then see that eventually lead to autoimmune disorder. And I also listened to this podcast episode with Dr. Gabor Mate. And he also, has this book about when the body says no. And he would systematically see patients that had chronic illnesses, be those that would, suppress themselves or live for others or sacrifice their own well-being in order to appease others, and ended up taking a toll on their health.
Yeah. And I can imagine, as you also said, that there's this preclinical autoimmune phase. Yeah. That this could be the period when the stress is actually having an effect on the immunity. Yeah. And on a very different note, but somehow related in my mind, I was listening to a podcast episode, a philosophy one, about emotional labor. Oh, nice. And how the task of emotional labor tends to fall onto women, and just this is known, carer roles and these sorts of responsibilities tend to fall onto women, and so there is this additional stress, similar to what you said with the case studies that you listened to.
Exactly. And it was quite inspiring, actually. There was this one woman that was talking about how she really then, due to several crisis moments with her autoimmune disorder, she had lupus, she then really dedicated her life to listening to her body, and she would meditate, do yoga every day, and really pay a lot of attention. And the doctors would look at her blood work and be saying things like, you should be in dialysis, how are you walking and functioning? But because she was, I don't know, the way she put it was, because she was so focused on listening to her body rather than what everyone else was saying, she was able to somehow manage the disease in a way where she didn't need to go that far, and ended up being in dialysis at least. And I thought that was quite inspiring about the power we have over our own body, and how trauma is so highly related to chronic illnesses, and in this case autoimmune illnesses. And when I say trauma, I don't it can be a traumatic event, but it can also be the emotional labor you were talking about. Yeah, so that was really interesting. But there's been several new therapeutic strategies. So initially, there are two main types of medicine given for those that have autoimmune disorders. The first line of drugs given are usually ones to mediate the inflammation. And as an example, with rheumatoid arthritis, you get given these disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs. However, these drugs are used as a first line of attack, but they have a lot of side effects, and they're also paired with things like steroids, and they were quite limited in their ability to actually treat, let alone achieve remission with those that have autoimmune disease. And
right, because you're just treating like the end point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for many years, this would be the extent of the treatment for diseases, which was quite limiting. However, in the 1990s, specifically in 1998, the first biological drug was approved. And biological drugs are made from proteins that are produced by genetically engineering cells grown in a laboratory, and usually they are monoclonal antibodies, which we spoke a lot about on our episode on antibiotic resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And they're cool because they can be really specific. We can modify them to target a specific antigen and be able to address any immune responses that occur in the body, any false immune responses, so that it can reduce the auto antibodies produced by the immune system. And this work dates back to the time where Ravinder Maini and Mark Feldman was working on it. And it's interesting because they first focused on this TNF inhibitor, which is a type of cytokine and is produced by immune cells that plays a key role in inflammation and is involved in both normal responses and pathogenic responses. But the clinical bodies and pharmaceutical companies weren't convinced that this could actually be clinically relevant, but they were able to really push it forward, and eventually it got approved and is now widely used. So biological agents have moved anti-inflammatory therapy to a level where there is a stable and sustained amelioration of disease, which was completely unseen in the pre-biological era. And it also provided evidence that inflammation is not only responsible for the immediate clinical effects, but also in the case of, for example, rheumatic disease, it also drives the destruction in the joints and extra-articular organs. So patients went from barely being able to manage their system, having loads of drugs that were causing all sorts of side effects, to then finally having something that works well and improves their life quality massively, and some even achieve remission, which is incredible. The downsides with biological agents, though, is that they're very expensive, and they are only used if the first line of defense doesn't work. They're only used in cases where the disease has already progressed a substantial amount. So to get there, it can be a bit painful.
Mm.
However, there are many cool new therapies emerging, which I will briefly cover. So one is called bispecific antibody therapy, and they are simply a new class of antibodies that can identify two different antigens, and this ameliorates the therapeutic options for autoimmune diseases. However, they are currently still going through many clinical trials, some with more success than others, but they still have a lot of side effects, so it's not really the next most viable option. But it's good that they are researching and that they're trying different techniques. And then there is RNA interference therapy. So they specifically look at small interfering RNAs, which can trigger efficient target gene silencing by inhibiting mRNA translation and promoting mRNA degradation. Its first use was approved by the FDA in 2018, which is great and very new. And currently this research for small interfering RNAs has been focused on mainly rheumatoid arthritis, but may be used to treat other diseases and seems to be quite promising. Then there's hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, which, as previously discussed, the fundamental mechanism of autoimmune diseases is the break of autoimmune tolerance due to environment and genetic factors. And this provides a treatment option to restore immune tolerance by replacing or resetting immune responses. And this is good because by basically resetting the immune responses, it allows for B cells to recover at a faster rate than T cells, which are usually the main culprit. And altogether, they can quench pre-existing autoimmune responses. However, because your body already has this, like, let's say, like, setting of what your immune responses are like, it can over time go back to where you were previous of this therapy. But it's still good that it helps mediate.
That's why I was wondering how the long-lasting changes can actually occur, like at the biological level.
Yeah.
Because I don't know enough about immune signaling, but yeah, I would expect that it could, if it's reactive in the first place, it would tend towards that reactivity.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, but I guess also, like, there must be so much variability across different autoimmune disorders because they have variable causes, and across individuals, and also across males and females, I suppose. Like, maybe different treatments are needed depending on your genetics.
Yeah.
So I guess moving towards, like, personalized medicine, which is expensive, but that could be an effective approach as well.
Yeah. Yeah, like, different people may have different rates of, like the B cells and T cells recovering at a different rate. So yeah, it may work better for some people than others. And then there's been strategies on antigen-specific immunotherapy and the use of nanomaterials and mRNA vaccine techniques to induce antigen-specific immune tolerance.
Yeah, just like a vaccine.
Yeah, so basically using vaccines with mRNA or DNA that can target the genetics, or using nanomaterials as a way to facilitate delivery of autoantigens to the target organs and help with the immune tolerance.
Oh, so you're, like, training the system to actually react to these.
Yeah, so basically the idea is that by delivering autoantigens in a controlled way, it can actually help restore immune tolerance rather than worsen autoimmunity. And this is known as antigen-specific immunotherapy, which aims to reprogram the immune system to stop attacking self-tissue. And when I say tolerance, it refers to the immune system's ability to recognize and not attack the body's own tissues and cells.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually, because it is exactly how vaccines work.
Yeah.
Like, in that, as like, you can threshold it, I guess.
Yeah.
If you're delivering it to a controlled level, then the body will learn to respond, but not over-respond. That leads to over-inflammation and symptoms.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what they're trying to do, and they're using biomaterials and nanoparticles for this type of drug delivery, which has also been emerging in the market. It's great because they can control the size, surface charge, shape, hydrophobicity, and may even make the drug delivery more effective and increase the efficacy, and also have higher cell targeting ability. And one of the most common ways to do this is to pack these autoantigens into gold nanoparticles, because they have features that ease with the synthesis and functionalization of transmitting this. Yeah, which is cool.
Yeah. It reminds me of the episode we did with Inga, because she studied material science and then she was working in transcriptomics, and we were talking about microRNA, and I don't think we actually spoke about, like, nanomaterials for medicine, but it just I feel like it just reminded me of that conversation, because it's interesting combining, like, genetics with synthesized nanomaterials for the optimal treatment. Yeah, definitely. And carrying on the theme of, like, drug delivery, so the skin has several abundant antigen presenting cells, and so a newly developed microneedle administration may effectively promote these antigen presenting cells to engulf autoantigens and induce the immune regulatory response. And this microneedle is great because it's a dry coated microneedle that binds with a topical steroid that can promote longer retention in the skin, and this can really help with treatments for example, diabetes type 1.
And because instead of using an intradermal injection, they can use a microneedle injection.
Oh, like for practical purposes.
Yeah, for practical purposes, which is just like, more efficient, and it can cause greater engulfing of the autoantigens. And then there's another way to deliver autoantigens, which is coupling them with probiotics, which is, a really specific type of probiotic. So to treat, for example, celiac disease, if you pair Lactococcus lactis with the desired drug or the autoantigen, it facilitates bystander immunosuppression and induces antigen-specific tolerance through the oral administration and utilization of, it's a genetically modified Lactococcus lactis, but it's the reason why it's used, it's because of its biocompatibility with the body, and they were able to just genetically modify it, and it makes for a really good co-delivery of these drugs. So it has like a mucosa targeted vehicle, and it can carry the drugs, including the peptides. So it's more like a mode of transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And that's pretty much it in terms of what I read about new treatments. A lot to do with drug delivery, targeting like inflammation, as well as regulation of the immune system. And yeah,
it's always nice to hear about what the latest progress is on medicine, and how, I guess the story is often that like drugs for a very long time have just been very non-specific and with loads of side effects, as you said. So to have drugs that target not only a specific location or mechanism, but also a specific part of the process of the development of the disease is quite good. And maybe combined with what you said about using T and B cell levels as biomarkers, if we had like a way to, although you'd need like frequent health screening, but if you could also combine those biomarkers to detect the start of autoimmune disorders early and then treat them early, that would be a lot more effective.
Yeah, definitely. And we all know that the best cure for a disease is to prevent it. So
exactly.
Yeah, if we could keep on top of that. And it's highly, it's genetic, so it's inheritable. So that's something to pay attention to. And also be aware of your environment and to listen to your body. And if you're feeling fatigued or your joints are a bit achy or any of those symptoms, maybe think about doing a screening. I think you can test for the T and B cells, but I think you can also do a genetic test to see if you have some of the more common genes. But it's really positive to see how, like you said, it went from these drugs that were non-specific and had loads of side effects to then biological agents, which seemed to be, the light at the end of the tunnel in a way, where people reacted extremely well to these drugs, to now having even more specific drugs with the level of specificity and attention to drug delivery that is quite positive. That even though the field went through a phase where they were just testing on male mice when they don't even have 2X chromosomes, to now really pushing ahead with all of these new therapies. And with that, I would like to end today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to share this episode with your friends or anyone that you know that may have an autoimmune disorder. And please check out our website, neuroversepod.com, for further resources and blog posts. And our social media handle is @neuroverse_pod. We'd like to thank the Biochemical Society for supporting Neuroverse, a podcast about science and philosophy. This episode is part of our series to disseminate research done in biochemistry.